The champagne flutes clinked like tiny bells across the terrace, their sound almost musical in the thick Virginia humidity. White tints billowed gently in the evening breeze, casting soft shadows over tables draped in cream linen. I stood near the marble fountain, watching my father work the crowd with the ease of a man who'd spent his entire life performing. His laughter carried across the garden, warm and practiced, as he shook hands with Richmond's elite. Councilmen, judges, business owners, they all gravitated toward Richard Whitfield like moths to a perfectly curated flame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My graduation gown hung in my apartment downtown, abandoned the moment I'd walked off the university stage that morning. Now I wore a simple navy dress, something forgettable, something that wouldn't draw attention. That's what I'd learned over the years. Blend into the background, let the spotlight find the others, survive the evening without incident. But tonight would shatter that illusion in ways I never imagined. Preston stood beside our father, his arm draped casually around Vanessa's waist. My brother had inherited Dad's presence, that magnetic quality that made people lean in when he spoke. His navy suit was tailored perfectly, his smile confident and unwavering. Vanessa laughed at something a guest said, her diamond bracelet catching the string lights overhead. They looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about successful Virginia families. And perhaps they did. I moved toward the dessert table, my heels clicking softly against the stone pathway. The cake sat in the center, 3 tiers of white fondant decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Congratulations, Amber, the script read, though the letters seemed too small, almost apologetic. Someone had pushed it slightly off-center, as if even the cake wasn't quite important enough to position properly. Dad's voice rose above the murmur of conversation, projecting across the garden with theatrical precision. Preston's campaign is going to transform this district. We're looking at real change, the kind of leadership Virginia deserves. Applause rippled through the crowd. My brother nodded humbly, playing his part with practiced grace. No one mentioned that it was my graduate degree in public policy they were supposedly celebrating tonight. The party had shifted focus within the first 20 minutes, becoming yet another platform for Preston's political ambitions. I picked up a glass of wine from a passing server, the cool stem grounding me as I watched the performance unfold. This was the Whitfield way. Turn every occasion into an opportunity, every gathering into a networking event. My graduation was simply convenient timing, a reason to assemble the right people in one place. Helen, my mother, glided between guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, her pearls reflecting the warm glow of the evening. She touched shoulders, kissed cheeks, whispered confidences that made people feel special and seen. It was her gift, making others feel important, while maintaining absolute control of the room's energy. Jordan, Preston's 17-year-old son, leaned against one of the tent poles, his phone glowing in his hands. He looked bored, his designer sneakers scuffing against the pristine lawn. Every so often he'd glance up, smirk at something, then return to his screen. The adults paid him no mind, too absorbed in their own conversations about zoning laws and fundraising quotas. The sun had started its descent, painting the Richmond skyline in shades of amber and rose. From the terrace you could see the James River winding through the city, a silver ribbon cutting through the green. It was beautiful objectively speaking, but beauty had always been the Whitfield family's best disguise. I found myself near the edge of the garden, where the manicured lawn met a row of ancient oak trees. Their branches created a canopy of shadows, a border between the performance and the real world beyond. I could hear traffic in the distance, the ordinary sounds of the city continuing its evening rhythm, indifferent to the carefully orchestrated gathering behind me. There you are. Vanessa appeared at my elbow, her smile bright and empty. Your father's about to make a toast. You should come closer. I followed her back toward the main gathering, weaving between clusters of guests. A city councilman I vaguely recognized nodded in my direction. Congratulations on your graduation, he offered, though his eyes were already moving past me, searching for more important connections. Thank you, I replied, but he'd already turned away. Dad stood on the raised section of the terrace now, a microphone in his hand. Someone had dimmed the string lights, creating a more intimate atmosphere. The crowd quieted, turning their attention toward him with the eager anticipation of people who knew they were about to witness something memorable. "Friends, colleagues, family," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight we celebrate achievement, dedication, and the bright future ahead." He paused, letting the words settle. "My son Preston has worked tirelessly to build a campaign that represents the values we hold dear in this community. His vision for Richmond's future is bold, necessary, and long overdue." More applause. Preston smiled, nodding his acknowledgement while maintaining an air of humble determination. Vanessa beamed beside him, her hand resting on his arm with practiced affection. "And of course," Dad continued almost as an afterthought, "we're proud of Amber for completing her degree. Education is valuable, even if it doesn't always lead to practical outcomes." The words landed like a slap disguised as praise. A few guests glanced my way, their expressions a mixture of pity and awkwardness. Even if it doesn't always lead to practical outcomes. The implication hung in the air: my degree, my work, my choices were decorative at best, irrelevant at worst. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face neutral. This wasn't new. Dad had been delivering these kinds of backhanded compliments my entire life, little cuts wrapped in the appearance of support. The skill was in making them sound almost generous, so that objecting would seem ungrateful. Helen stepped forward, taking the microphone from my father. Her smile was luminous, her voice warm. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. This family has been blessed beyond measure, and we're so grateful to share these moments with all of you." She gestured toward the dessert table. "Please enjoy the cake, enjoy the evening. This is a celebration of everything the Whitfield family represents." Everything the Whitfield family represents. I wondered if she heard the irony in her own words. Did she know what this family truly represented? The careful construction of appearance over substance, the elevation of image over truth, the systematic erasure of anyone who didn't fit the narrative they decided to tell? As guests moved toward the cake, I remained rooted near the fountain. The water burbled softly behind me, a constant presence that felt more real than anything else at this gathering. I thought about leaving, simply walking down the driveway and calling a rideshare back to my apartment in Scott's Addition. No one would miss me. They might not even notice I'd gone. But something kept me there, some stubborn kernel of hope that maybe, just maybe, this night might be different. That someone might acknowledge what I'd actually accomplished. That my father might pull me aside and tell me he was proud, genuinely proud, of the work I'd done. Jordan had abandoned his post by the tent pole and now stood near the cake, his phone held up at an angle. He was filming something, probably documenting the party for social media. The Whitfield family image had to be maintained across all platforms after all. Curated perfection was a full-time job. I watched as Preston cut the first slice, the knife sliding through the fondant with ease. Flashbulbs popped as guests captured the moment. Vanessa laughed at something, her head tilted back in that way that made her look both elegant and approachable. They were good at this, I had to admit. They understood the performance, embraced it, thrived in it. A server offered me a plate with a slice of cake, but I declined. My appetite had vanished somewhere between Dad's toast and the growing realization that I was essentially a prop in my own graduation party. The cake, like everything else tonight, wasn't really for me. The conversation flowed around me in waves, discussions of campaign strategy, upcoming elections, the political landscape of Virginia. Preston held court near the center of the terrace, surrounded by men in expensive suits who hung on his every word. He spoke about infrastructure, education reform, economic development. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd written half the policy papers he was casually referencing, research I'd done during late nights in the university library, while he'd been networking at country club dinners. "Amber." Walter Brennan appeared beside me, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. Walter had been my father's political consultant for decades, though he'd semi-retired a few years back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was one of the few people in this crowd who'd ever treated me like an actual person rather than an accessory. "Congratulations on your master's degree. Public policy, right?" "Yes," I said, grateful for even this small acknowledgement. focused on campaign finance reform and grassroots organizing. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Interesting choice. Timely too, given the current climate. He glanced toward Preston, then back to me. You planning to put that degree to use? That's the goal, I replied, though I had no idea what that actually meant yet. Every job I'd applied for in Richmond seemed to evaporate the moment they realized I was Richard Whitfield's daughter. Too risky, too complicated, too much potential for conflict of interest. My last name had become a liability rather than an asset. Walter studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You know, I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen a lot of families like yours, the ones that look perfect from the outside. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who understands the game better than anyone else. Before I could respond, Jordan's voice cut through the ambient noise. Hey everyone, check this out. He projected his phone screen onto the display monitor someone had set up for the party slideshow. Instead of family photos, a video played shaky footage of me from earlier in the day, walking across the graduation stage. Someone in the crowd had filmed it and posted it online. But Jordan had edited it, added a mocking caption that flashed across the bottom. When you get a degree but still need dad's money. Laughter erupted from the younger guests. Even some of the adults chuckled, uncomfortable but unwilling to correct the teenager. My face burned. Preston glanced at the screen, shook his head with an indulgent smile but said nothing. Vanessa whispered something to the woman beside her, both of them glancing my way. Helen maintained her hostess smile, as if this was all perfectly normal family teasing. And Dad just continued his conversation with a state delegate, completely unbothered by his grandson's public humiliation of his daughter. That's when something inside me shifted. Not broke, not shattered, shifted. Like a tectonic plate adjusting after years of pressure, finally finding a new position. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn their respect, their acknowledgement, their love. I'd achieved academic honors, volunteered on campaigns, written policy proposals that even veteran politicians praised. And still I was the punchline, the afterthought, the family disappointment. I set my wine glass down on the nearest table and walked toward the house. No dramatic exit, no tearful scene. Just a quiet departure from a party that had never really been mine to begin with. Behind me, the laughter continued, the conversations flowed. The performance went on without missing a beat. Inside the house, the air conditioning hit my flushed skin like a shock. The Whitfield mansion always felt like a museum. All carefully preserved antiques and family portraits documenting generations of successful, powerful people. I'd grown up in these halls, but I'd never really belonged to them. Not the way Preston did, with his easy confidence and natural charisma. Not the way Jordan did, secure in his position as the golden grandchild who could do no wrong. I found myself in Dad's study, a room I'd always been discouraged from entering. Dark wood panels, leather furniture, walls lined with books that were more decorative than functional. His desk dominated the space, its surface organized with military precision. A photo of Preston in his college rowing uniform held a place of pride. A picture of Jordan at his private school graduation sat beside it. I scanned the room, searching for any evidence of my existence. Finally, on a side table near the window, I found a photo from my high school graduation. It was smaller than the others, partially obscured by a stack of political journals. Even here, in the private space that was supposed to represent family history, I was an afterthought. The study door opened. I turned, expecting Helen with some gentle reprimand about leaving my own party. Instead, Walter stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "You okay?" he asked, his voice kind but direct. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I'd been trained to give. "No, you're not." He moved to the window, looking out at the party below. The guests mingled in their golden bubble of light, separate from the darkness gathering beyond the estate. "I've known your father for 30 years. I've watched him build empires on the backs of people who believed in him. Sometimes those people were employees. Sometimes they were constituents." He paused. "Sometimes they were family." I stayed silent, unsure where this was going. 3 years ago, Walter continued, I helped Preston launch his first campaign. Small thing, city council seat. He needed seed money, startup capital to get the operation moving. Your father put in 20,000, made a big show of it, talked about investing in the next generation. He turned to face me. What Preston doesn't talk about is the other 70,000 that came in anonymously through a PAC. Money that funded the real campaign, the one that actually got him elected. My heart started beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying I know where that money came from, Amber. I processed the paperwork. And I know your father took credit for it. Let everyone believe he was the generous patriarch supporting his son's dreams. Walter's expression was somber. But it wasn't his money. It was yours. The room seemed to tilt. That's not possible. I didn't have $70,000 3 years ago. You did, Walter said quietly. Your grandmother's trust. It matured when you turned 25. The bank sent the notification to your father's office, since he was listed as the estate executor. He never told you, did he? I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to process this information. My grandmother had died when I was 16. I'd known she'd left me something, but Dad had always been vague about the details, promising he'd handle everything when the time was right. He diverted the funds, Walter continued. Set up the PAC, funneled your inheritance into Preston's campaign. Perfectly legal technically. The paperwork was clean. But morally? He shook his head. Your money launched your brother's political career. And you never knew. The pieces started falling into place. Preston's sudden success, his rapid rise in Richmond politics, the network of donors who seemed to appear out of nowhere. It hadn't been his charisma or Dad's connections alone. It had been my grandmother's money, my inheritance, used without my knowledge or consent. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice barely steady. Because tomorrow, Senator Elizabeth Hartley is announcing her re-election campaign. And she's going to specifically thank several key donors who've supported her over the years. Your name is on that list, Amber. Your real contributions, the ones your father's been hiding. Walter pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. I have the documentation. Every transfer, every donation, every dollar that should have been yours. I thought you should know before it becomes public knowledge. I took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, PAC filings. A paper trail that told a story my family had worked hard to bury. My inheritance hadn't just funded Preston's city council campaign. Over the past 3 years, it had been systematically used to support multiple candidates, building political capital in my father's name while I struggled to pay for textbooks and lived in a 400-square-foot apartment. The senator's chief of staff reached out to me last week, Walter said. They were doing donor research, trying to track down everyone who'd contributed to her campaigns. When they dug into the PAC records, they found your name. Your actual name on the original trust transfers. They wanted to thank you personally. Through the window, I could see the party continuing below. Preston laughing, Dad shaking hands, Helen orchestrating the perfect evening. None of them knew what was coming. None of them realized that tomorrow, their carefully constructed narrative was going to crack wide open. What do? I whispered. Walter moved toward the door, then paused. That's your decision to make. But Amber? You've spent your whole life trying to earn their approval. Maybe it's time to stop trying and start living. He opened the door, letting the sound of the party drift in. Happy graduation. For real this time. After he left, I stood alone in my father's study, clutching evidence of betrayal that went deeper than I'd imagined. Outside, someone started playing music. Jazz, smooth and sophisticated, the kind of soundtrack that made everything seem elegant even when it was rotting underneath. I looked at the photo of Preston on the desk, his confident smile frozen in time. Tomorrow, a United States senator was going to publicly acknowledge my contributions to her campaign. My father, who'd called my degree impractical, who'd let Jordan mock me, who'd turned my graduation into Preston's networking event. He had no idea what was about to happen. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional, uncontrolled. This was something else entirely. This was truth, backed by documentation and delivered by someone he couldn't dismiss or discredit. This was justice, wrapped in political protocol and impossible to ignore. I slipped the envelope into my purse and walked back toward the party, but I didn't rejoin the gathering. Instead, I moved through the shadows along the edge of the garden, past the laughter and the clinking glasses, past the performance that had defined my entire life. At the edge of the property, I looked back one more time at the golden glow of the terrace, at the family that had never really seen me. Tomorrow everything would change. Tonight I just needed to survive until morning. I drove back to my apartment in Scott's Addition through streets that blurred with rain. The storm had rolled in fast, the way summer storms do in Virginia, turning the city into a watercolor painting of neon and headlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the black leather. The envelope from Walter sat in my passenger seat, its contents heavy with implications I hadn't fully processed yet. The apartment building was quiet when I arrived, most residents already settled in for the night. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my unit, my heels echoing in the concrete stairwell. Inside, the space felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything I'd learned. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there in the dark, listening to the rain hammer against the windows. For a long moment I didn't move, didn't turn on the lights, didn't change out of my dress. I just stood there, letting the reality of the situation wash over me in waves. My grandmother's trust. $70,000. 3 years of donations made in my name, credited to my father's political influence, used to build a network I'd never been invited to join. Finally, I switched on the small lamp by the couch and spread the documents across my coffee table. Bank statements showed the trust maturing on my 25th birthday, exactly as Walter had said. The money had been transferred to an account I'd never opened, under my name but with my father listed as administrator. From there, it had flowed into various political action committees, each donation carefully structured to stay within legal limits while maximizing impact. I found contribution records for Preston's city council race, just as Walter had mentioned. But there was more. Money had gone to the district attorney's campaign, the state delegate's re-election, even a school board race. My inheritance had been weaponized, turned into political currency that bought access and influence. And at the top of every donor list, in the communications and thank you letters, Richard Whitfield's name appeared as the generous benefactor bringing along his family's support. The documentation was meticulous. Someone had kept careful records, probably for tax purposes or legal protection. I wondered if my father had ever considered that this paper trail might someday reveal the truth. Or maybe he'd been so confident in his control, so certain that I'd never question anything, that the possibility of discovery hadn't even occurred to him. I picked up one particular document, a letter from Senator Elizabeth Hartley's campaign, thanking the Whitfield Family Trust for its continued support. The trust that bore my grandmother's name. The trust that had been established specifically for me, her only granddaughter, the child she'd spent countless afternoons with while my parents attended fundraisers and political dinners. My grandmother had understood something fundamental about the Whitfield family that I'd been too young to articulate. She'd seen how my father operated, how he turned every relationship into a transaction, every connection into leverage. That's why she'd structured the trust the way she had, with specific instructions that the money was to be used for my education and future independence. Not for political donations. Not for building someone else's career. I thought about her final months, how she'd held my hand in the hospital and made me promise to find my own path. Don't let them tell you who to be, she'd whispered, her voice thin but determined. You're more than this family's expectations. I'd been 19 then, still naive enough to believe that love and loyalty could coexist with honesty. Still hopeful that my family's coldness was temporary, something that would thaw once I proved myself worthy. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 urgent fingers. I moved to the window and looked out at Scott's Addition, at the old warehouses converted to breweries and art studios, at the young professionals who'd chosen this neighborhood because it represented something authentic in a city often obsessed with tradition and pedigree. I'd moved here after graduate school specifically because it wasn't the West End, wasn't the neighborhood where everyone knew the Whitfield name and made assumptions about who I was based on my father's reputation. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Helen asking if I'd gotten home safely. Another from Vanessa saying the party had been lovely and congratulations again. Nothing from my father. Nothing from Preston. Jordan had probably already forgotten I existed, moved on to his next source of entertainment. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching Senator Hartley's upcoming announcement. Her campaign website showed a press conference scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning at the Capitol building. The event was open to media and supporters, a formal kickoff to her re-election campaign. According to the schedule, she'd be recognizing key donors and outlining her policy priorities for the coming term. Walter had said my name was on the list of donors to be thanked. I tried to imagine the scene, my father sitting in his study watching the news coverage, Preston standing beside him discussing strategy for his own upcoming race. The moment when Senator Hartley would mention my contributions, crediting me directly rather than hiding behind the family name or the PAC structure. Would they be confused at first? Angry? Would they realize immediately what had happened, or would it take time for the implications to sink in? I pulled up my banking app and checked my accounts. The balance was exactly what I expected, modest savings from part-time work during graduate school, and the small stipend I'd received as a research assistant. No mysterious deposits, no trust fund suddenly appearing. My father had been thorough in his deception, making sure I had no access to money that was legally mine. The question was what to do about it. I could confront him directly, show him the documentation and demand an explanation, but I already knew how that conversation would go. He'd minimize it, reframe the situation as him making wise investments on my behalf, protecting me from the complexities of political finance. He'd make me feel ungrateful for questioning his judgment, unsophisticated for not understanding how these things worked. That was his talent, turning every criticism into evidence of the critic's inadequacy. Or I could wait. Let the senator make her announcement. Let the public recognition happen organically, without warning, without giving him time to craft a narrative or control the story. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For once, I wouldn't be reacting to their agenda. I'd simply be present for the truth revealing itself. I made coffee even though it was nearly midnight, needing something to do with my hands. The apartment smelled like the dark roast I'd bought from a local shop, rich and slightly bitter. I carried the mug back to the couch and continued reading through the documents, absorbing every detail. There were donation receipts spanning 3 years, each one bearing my name but processed through accounts I'd never authorized. The total amount was staggering when I added it up. Nearly $90,000 of my inheritance had been funneled into political campaigns without my knowledge. My grandmother had been a school teacher, not a wealthy socialite. She'd saved carefully over decades, lived modestly and invested wisely. That $90,000 represented her life's work, her careful planning, her love for me expressed through financial security she'd never had growing up. And my father had treated it like his personal political war chest, spending it to buy influence and connections that benefited everyone but me. I thought about all the times I'd struggled during graduate school. The semester I'd lived on ramen and peanut butter because textbooks cost more than I'd budgeted for. The summer I'd worked 2 jobs to afford my apartment deposit. The professional clothes I'd bought secondhand for interviews because new ones weren't in my budget. All while my inheritance was funding campaign dinners and political advertisements, building a network that had my name attached but that I'd never been invited to access. The anger came then, hot and clarifying. Not the explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the sustained kind that settles into your bones and changes something fundamental about how you see the world. I'd been so focused on earning their approval, on proving I was as capable as Preston, as valuable as the golden child they'd invested in. I'd internalized their dismissal of my accomplishments, their subtle suggestions that my choices were impractical or naive. But the truth was different. I hadn't failed to measure up to their standards. They'd stolen from me, systematically and deliberately, while making me feel like the problem was my inability to appreciate their vision for my life. They'd used my own money to build the very system that excluded me, then blamed me for not finding success within it. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Amber Whitfield? The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. Yes, who is this? My name is Patricia Vance. I'm the Chief of Staff for Senator Hartley. I apologize for calling so late, but Walter Brennan suggested I reach out to you directly. She paused. I understand this might come as a surprise, but we've been reviewing our donor records in preparation for tomorrow's announcement, and your contributions to the senator's campaigns have been significant. We wanted to extend a personal invitation for you to attend the press conference. I sat up straighter, my heart rate accelerating. Walter told me my name was on the list to be recognized. More than that, Patricia said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. You're one of our top individual donors over the past 3 years. The senator specifically wants to acknowledge your support. We understand the contributions came through various PACs, but we've traced them back to your grandmother's trust. Senator Hartley wanted me to tell you personally that she remembers your grandmother. They served on an education committee together years ago. She was a remarkable woman. My throat tightened. She was. The senator would be honored if you join us on stage tomorrow when we recognize our major supporters. It's scheduled for 10 o'clock, but we'd like you to arrive at 9:30 for a brief meeting beforehand. Would that be possible? I looked at the documents spread across my coffee table, at the evidence of everything my family had hidden. Tomorrow morning I could walk onto that stage. I could stand beside a United States senator while she publicly thanked me for contributions I hadn't even known I'd made. My father would be watching. Preston would be watching. Everyone in Richmond's political circles would be watching. Yes, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll be there. After Patricia ended the call, I sat in the silence of my apartment listening to the rain slow to a gentle patter. The storm was passing, leaving the city washed clean and glistening. Tomorrow felt impossibly close and impossibly far away at the same time. I thought about calling someone, sharing this news with a friend or colleague, but who would I call? Most of my friendships had been strained by my family's reputation, by the complications that came with being Richard Whitfield's daughter. I thought about Walter, about his decision to bring me this information. He'd worked with my father for decades, built his career alongside the Whitfield family's rise to prominence. But he'd chosen to tell me the truth, to give me the evidence I needed to understand what had been done. Maybe he'd grown tired of watching the pattern repeat. Maybe he'd cared about my grandmother enough to honor what she'd intended for me. Or maybe, after 40 years in politics, he'd simply decided that some betrayals were too fundamental to ignore. I gathered the documents and put them back in the envelope, then placed it carefully in my desk drawer. Evidence, ammunition, proof, whatever you wanted to call it, I had it now. The truth had weight, substance, documentation. It couldn't be gaslit away or reframed or dismissed as my misunderstanding of the situation. Sleep felt impossible, so I made more coffee and opened my laptop. I started drafting an email to my father, typing out everything I wanted to say. The anger poured onto the screen in paragraphs that grew increasingly raw and unfiltered. I wrote about the graduation party, about Jordan's mockery, about the years of subtle dismissals and backhanded compliments. I wrote about discovering the trust, about the money that should have been mine, about the political network built on my grandmother's savings. When I finished, the document was 6 pages long and filled with accusations that felt both justified and somehow inadequate. Words couldn't capture the full weight of what had been done, couldn't convey the years of feeling like I was failing some test I couldn't quite understand. I read through it twice, then saved it as a draft and closed the laptop. Sending it would accomplish nothing. He'd deny, deflect, or simply ignore it. The email would become another example of my being overly sensitive, my inability to understand how the real world worked. No, this required something different. Not words sent in the middle of the night, easily dismissed or deleted. This required presence, visibility, proof that couldn't be argued away. Tomorrow's press conference would provide exactly that. A public acknowledgement of contributions I'd made unknowingly, presented by someone my father couldn't discredit or silence. Senator Hartley's credibility would lend weight to the truth in ways my own voice never could. I walked to my bedroom and finally changed out of my dress, hanging it carefully in the closet. The fabric still smelled faintly of the party, that mixture of perfume and catered food and expensive wine. I thought about the version of myself who'd arrived at that gathering just hours ago, still hoping for acknowledgement, still believing that this time might be different. That Amber felt like a stranger now, someone naive enough to think that family loyalty meant anything when power and image were at stake. The version of myself standing in this bedroom was different, clearer. The scales had fallen away, revealing the machinery beneath the performance. I understood now that I'd never failed to measure up to their standards. The standards themselves had been designed to ensure I stayed small, stayed grateful, Stayed in a position where I could be useful without threatening the hierarchy they'd established. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed a floor. Outside, a car passed by with music thumping from open windows. Normal sounds of life. Continuing, oblivious to the small revolution happening in apartment 307. My phone lit up one more time. A text from Walter with just 3 words and a time. Be yourself. 9:30. I set an alarm for 7, giving myself plenty of time to prepare. What did one wear to a press conference where your family's carefully constructed lies were about to be publicly dismantled? The question felt absurd and critical at the same time. I settled on professional but understated, the kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention away from the message but wouldn't suggest I was trying to hide either. Finally, exhaustion caught up with the adrenaline. I closed my eyes and let sleep pull me under. My last conscious thought, a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Tomorrow the performance would crack. Tomorrow truth would have documentation. Tomorrow I would stop trying to earn love from people who'd only ever seen me as a resource to exploit. The alarm pulled me from dreams I couldn't quite remember. Fragments of gardens and stages and documents that multiplied every time I tried to read them. I made coffee and stood at the window, watching Scott's edition wake up around me. Joggers passed on the sidewalk below. A delivery truck stopped at the brewery across the street. The city moved forward into another Friday morning, unaware that my entire world was about to shift on its axis. I showered and dressed with deliberate care, each movement steady and purposeful. Navy blazer, white blouse, tailored pants. Simple jewelry, minimal makeup. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Not because I looked different, but because something in my eyes had changed. The constant apology was gone, replaced by something harder and clearer. At 8:45, I drove toward downtown Richmond. The Capitol building rose white and imposing against the blue sky, the storm from the night before leaving everything washed and bright. I found parking in a nearby garage and walked the 3 blocks to the building's entrance, my heels clicking against the sidewalk with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Patricia Vance met me in the lobby, her handshake firm and her smile genuine. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional twist. Thank you for coming, Amber. The senator is really looking forward to meeting you. She led me through security and up to a conference room where several staff members were reviewing talking points for the press conference. Senator Hartley stood near the window, studying notes on a tablet. She looked up when we entered, and her expression shifted to something warm and knowing. Amber Whitfield, she said, crossing the room to shake my hand. You have your grandmother's eyes. Margaret was one of the sharpest people I ever worked with. I was so sorry to hear about her passing. The mention of my grandmother by name, the personal connection, made my throat tight. Thank you, Senator. She spoke highly of you as well. I'm sure this has all been quite surprising, Senator Hartley said, gesturing for me to sit. Patricia tells me you only recently learned about the extent of your contributions to our campaigns. That's accurate, I said carefully. I inherited a trust from my grandmother, but I was never informed it had matured or how the funds were being used. The senator's expression hardened slightly. Yes, we gathered that from our research. The PAC structure was legal technically, but the ethics are questionable at best. Your grandmother set up that trust specifically for your future, not for political donations made in your name without your consent. She leaned forward, her tone becoming more direct. I want you to know that if you're uncomfortable with us recognizing your contributions publicly, we can handle this differently. But I also want you to understand that what was done to you was wrong. You have every right to reclaim your story, and we'd be honored to help facilitate that. I thought about my father watching this press conference from his study, Preston seeing his younger sister acknowledged by a senator he'd been trying to impress for years. The entire network of political operatives and donors realizing that the Whitfield family's generosity had been funded by someone they'd systematically ignored and dismissed. I want to be recognized, I said clearly. I want people to know the truth. Senator Hartley smiled, the expression both kind and slightly fierce. Then let's make sure they do. The press conference room filled quickly with reporters, cameras, and political operatives who'd come to witness Senator Hartley's re-election announcement. I stood backstage with Patricia and several other major donors, my palms slightly damp despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see the crowd settling into their seats, notebooks open, cameras positioned for optimal angles. This was the machinery of political theater, the carefully orchestrated performance that shaped public perception and built careers. Patricia touched my elbow gently. You'll be introduced third, right after Lawrence Chun from the Banking Association and Rebecca Torres from the Education Foundation. When you hear your name, just walk to the senator's left side and stand there while she speaks about your contributions. Smile, look confident, and try not to look directly into the camera lights. They're blinding. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. Somewhere in that audience or watching the live stream, my father would see this. The thought made my stomach clench with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more complex than either emotion, a tangle of vindication and grief and long overdue anger finally finding its voice. The lights dimmed slightly and Senator Hartley walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. She wore a burgundy suit that photographed well, her gray hair styled in a way that suggested both professionalism and approachability. I'd seen her on television countless times, watched her debate and legislate and navigate the complex world of Virginia politics. But seeing her in person, commanding the room with practiced ease, I understood why she'd held her seat for 3 terms. She had presence, that indefinable quality that made people lean forward and listen. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying easily through the sound system. "Thank you all for being here as we officially launch this campaign. The work ahead of us is significant, but I've never been one to shy away from challenges." She spoke about her policy priorities, her vision for Virginia's future, the coalition she built and intended to strengthen. The journalists scribbled notes, their faces showing the professional skepticism that came with covering politics for years. Nothing she said was particularly revolutionary, but it was solid, competent, the kind of messaging that reassured voters she knew what she was doing. Then her tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal. But before we dive into the specifics of this campaign, I want to take a moment to recognize the people who make this work possible. Not the big corporations or the wealthy developers, though their support matters too. I'm talking about the individuals who believe in public service, who invest in our shared future, who understand that democracy requires participation. Patricia gestured for the first donor to prepare. Lawrence Chun straightened his tie and moved toward the stage entrance. Senator Hartley continued speaking, describing the importance of grassroots funding and individual contributions. When she called Lawrence's name, he walked out to polite applause, standing beside her while she detailed his years of support and commitment to financial reform. Rebecca Torres followed, receiving recognition for her work in education advocacy and her generous contributions to scholarship programs. She smiled warmly at the audience, comfortable in this environment, clearly someone who'd done this kind of thing before. Then Senator Hartley paused, and I saw her glance down at her notes with what looked like deliberate emphasis. "Our next donor represents something I think is particularly important to acknowledge. In politics, we often talk about legacy, about family traditions of service and engagement. But sometimes legacy takes unexpected forms." My heart started hammering against my ribs. Patricia gave me a gentle push toward the stage entrance. I took a breath and stepped into the lights. "Please welcome Amber Whitfield," Senator Hartley said, and the applause that followed had a different quality to it. Curious, interested, perhaps confused by those who recognized my last name and were trying to reconcile what they knew about the Whitfield family with this moment. I walked to Senator Hartley's left side, my legs steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. The lights were indeed blinding, creating a wall of white that made the audience invisible. Somewhere beyond that wall, cameras were transmitting this image across Richmond and beyond. My father's phone was probably ringing. Preston was probably frozen in whatever he'd been doing. Helen was likely calling everyone she knew, trying to understand what was happening. Amber's grandmother, Margaret Whitfield, was a dedicated educator and someone I had the privilege of working with on several committees early in my career, Senator Hartley continued. Margaret believed deeply in the power of education and political engagement to transform lives. When she passed away, she left a trust specifically for her granddaughter, intended to support Amber's future and her own civic participation. I kept my expression neutral, but inside something was shifting. Senator Hartley wasn't just acknowledging my donations. She was telling the story, providing context that made the situation impossible to misinterpret. Over the past 3 years, funds from that trust have supported not just my campaigns, but numerous local and state races. These contributions totaled nearly $90,000, making Amber one of our most significant individual donors. She turned to look at me directly, her expression kind but pointed. What makes this particularly noteworthy is that until very recently, Amber had no idea these donations were being made in her name. A murmur rippled through the audience. I saw journalists straighten in their seats, their professional instincts recognizing that this wasn't standard political theater. This was a story, something with edges and complications that went beyond typical campaign messaging. Senator Hartley continued with careful precision. The trust was managed by family members who made these political contributions without Amber's knowledge or consent, despite the fact that the money was legally and ethically hers to control. This represents not just a personal betrayal, but a fundamental violation of the donor transparency and individual agency we claim to value in our political system. The murmur grew louder. I could hear whispered conversations, the rapid clicking of laptop keys as reporters started filing updates. Someone shouted a question from the back, but Senator Hartley raised her hand for silence. I'm sharing this not to embarrass anyone or to create scandal, but because Amber deserves recognition for contributions made in her name. She deserves to reclaim her story and her agency. And frankly, we all deserve to know who's really funding our political system, and whether those donors have actual knowledge and consent regarding how their resources are being used. She placed her hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that the cameras captured from multiple angles. Amber recently completed her master's degree in public policy, focusing on campaign finance reform and grassroots organizing. Her academic work has been exceptional, and I have no doubt she'll make significant contributions to Virginia's political landscape in her own right, on her own terms. The applause that followed was different from what the previous donors had received. It was warmer, more genuine, touched with the kind of sympathy people feel when they recognize injustice being called out and corrected. I managed a smile, blinking against the lights, trying to process the fact that this was actually happening. Senator Hartley guided me back to stand with the other recognized donors while she finished her remarks. But the rest of the press conference felt surreal. Her words about policy positions and campaign goals washing over me while my mind raced ahead to what came next. The journalists were already pulling out their phones between official questions, undoubtedly researching the Whitfield family and trying to piece together the fuller story. When the formal presentation ended, reporters swarmed forward with questions. Several tried to reach me, but Patricia intercepted them with professional efficiency. Ms. Whitfield isn't taking questions at this time, but will have a prepared statement available later this afternoon. She guided me toward a side exit, away from the main crowd. Senator Hartley caught up with us in the hallway, her public persona softening into something more personal once we were out of camera range. "You did beautifully," she said. "I know that wasn't easy. Thank you for telling the truth," I managed. "For giving context instead of just listing my name. Your grandmother would have insisted on it," Senator Hartley replied. "Margaret didn't believe in half-truths or convenient omissions. She thought clarity was a moral obligation, especially in politics." She glanced at Patricia. "Make sure Amber has everything she needs. Contact information for our legal team if she wants it, resources for dealing with media attention, whatever she needs." Patricia nodded and led me to a small conference room away from the main activity. She handed me a bottle of water and a folder with several documents inside. "These are contact numbers for attorneys who specialize in trust law and financial exploitation. The senator wanted you to have options if you decide to pursue legal action against your family." I opened the folder and scanned the contents. 3 law firms, all reputable, all with experience in cases involving financial abuse and breach of fiduciary duty. There were also media guidelines, suggestions for how to handle interview requests and public statements. Senator Hartley's team had clearly thought through the implications of what they were doing, understood that exposing this situation would create ripples they wanted to help me navigate. "Your phone is probably about to explode," Patricia said gently. Family, friends, reporters, everyone who saw the press conference or heard about it secondhand. My advice is to turn it off for a few hours. Give yourself time to process before you deal with their reactions. I pulled out my phone and saw that she was right. 17 missed calls, dozens of texts, voicemail notifications piling up faster than I could track them. My father's name appeared multiple times. Preston had called 6 times. Even Vanessa had reached out, her message just a string of question marks. I powered down the phone completely and set it on the table. The silence that followed felt like a small act of mercy, a brief respite before the storm of consequences really began. There's a back exit that will take you to the parking garage, Patricia said. I'd recommend using that. There are already reporters staking out the main entrance, and while you have every right to speak with them, you should do it on your terms when you're ready. I thanked her and gathered my things, the folder of legal resources feeling heavy in my hands. As I walked through the Capitol building's back corridors, past offices where the real work of governance happened away from cameras and public scrutiny, I thought about my grandmother. She'd worked in schools for 40 years, shaping young minds and fighting for educational equity on a teacher's salary. She'd saved carefully, invested wisely, and built something substantial enough to give her granddaughter options and freedom. My father had seen that freedom as something to exploit, a resource to redirect toward his own priorities. He'd turned my grandmother's love into political capital, my inheritance into networking opportunities, my name into a tool for accessing circles I was never actually invited to join. And he'd done it so smoothly, so systematically, that I'd never even known to ask questions. The parking garage was cool and dim after the brightness of the press conference. I found my car and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. I just stood on a stage beside a United States senator while she detailed my family's betrayal to a room full of journalists and political operatives. The story was out there now, circulating through Richmond's interconnected networks of power and influence. There was no taking it back. No way to smooth it over or reframe it as a misunderstanding. Senator Hartley had been too specific, too detailed, too clear in her presentation of the facts. My father couldn't dismiss this as my being overly sensitive or not understanding how things worked. He couldn't make me the problem this time. I drove back towards Scott's Addition on autopilot, my mind elsewhere. The streets looked the same as they had that morning, but everything felt different. I'd crossed some invisible line, stepped from one version of my life into another. The old Amber, who'd spent years trying to earn approval from people determined not to give it, felt like someone I used to know. This new version, who just claimed her story in the most public way possible, was still forming, still figuring out what came next. My apartment building appeared ahead, its red brick facade warm in the late morning sun. I parked in my usual spot and climbed the stairs slowly, exhaustion starting to replace the adrenaline that had carried me through the morning. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Coffee mug in the sink, documents still in the desk drawer. The same furniture and books and small evidences of my life. But I was different. I moved to the window and looked out at the neighborhood, at the breweries and studios and young professionals going about their Friday routines. Somewhere across town, my father was probably in crisis mode. Preston was likely doing damage control. Helen was almost certainly calling family friends with some carefully crafted explanation that positioned them as victims of my ingratitude or instability. Let them scramble. Let them experience what it felt like to have their narrative challenged, their control disrupted, their carefully maintained image cracked open for public examination. I'd spent 28 years accommodating their version of reality, contorting myself to fit their expectations. That time was over. I made tea and sat on the couch, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of what had happened. Relief, grief, anger, satisfaction, fear. They all tangled together in my chest, making it hard to breathe properly. I'd wanted this, had known it was necessary, but that didn't make it easy. Severing ties with family, even family that had exploited and dismissed you, still hurt in ways that were hard to articulate. Around noon I turned my phone back on. The notifications came flooding in, so many that the device seemed to vibrate continuously for nearly a minute. I ignored most of them, but I did read the text from Walter. Proud of you. Your grandmother would be too. That simple message, 7 words of acknowledgement, meant more than everything else combined. Walter had known my grandmother, had understood what she'd intended, had cared enough to give me the information I needed to reclaim what was mine. In a world full of people who'd stood by while I was exploited, he'd been the one willing to break ranks and tell the truth. I composed a brief response. "Thank you for everything. I mean that." Then I scrolled through the other messages, reading them with a kind of detached curiosity. My father's texts progressed from demanding to angry to almost pleading. "Call me immediately. This is a family matter that should have been handled privately. You're making a mistake you'll regret. We need to talk before this gets worse." But it couldn't get worse for me. I'd already lost their approval, their inclusion, their affection. What more could they take? The money was already gone, spent without my consent. The relationships were already hollow, maintained only through my willingness to accept less than I deserved. Standing on that stage hadn't destroyed anything real. It had just made the existing destruction visible. Preston's messages were shorter, more controlled. "I don't understand why you did this. We should have discussed it as a family. This affects all of us, not just you." That was the problem, wasn't it? In Preston's worldview, my inheritance wasn't really mine. It was family resources, available to be deployed however the family decided. My consent was irrelevant because in his framework I was supposed to trust that they knew best. The idea that I might have my own priorities, my own vision for how to use my grandmother's gift, hadn't even occurred to him. Helen's texts were the most interesting. They lacked the anger of my father's messages or the confusion of Preston's. Instead, they were carefully neutral, feeling out the situation without committing to a position. "I hope you're okay. This must be overwhelming. Let's talk when you're ready." She was hedging her bets, I realized, waiting to see how this played out publicly before deciding which side to take. If the story died quickly, if I ended up looking unstable or vindictive in media coverage, she'd align with my father and Preston. But if the narrative held, if public opinion sided with me, she'd position herself as the misunderstood mother who'd always supported me but been overruled by the men in the family. It was strategic, calculated, quintessentially Helen. I put the phone down and opened my laptop. The news coverage had already begun. Local stations were running stories about the press conference, focusing on Senator Hartley's unusual decision to highlight donor controversy during a campaign announcement. Several articles mentioned my name specifically, describing me as the daughter of prominent political consultant Richard Whitfield and questioning whether this represented a family rift with larger implications for Richmond's political landscape. One journalist had already dug up my academic record, noting my recent graduate degree and my focus on campaign finance reform. The irony wasn't lost on the writer, who pointed out that I'd been studying the very systems that had been used to exploit my own resources without my knowledge. Another article quoted anonymous sources from within Richmond's political circles expressing surprise that Richard Whitfield would have mismanaged family finances so dramatically, given his reputation for strategic thinking and careful planning. The comments sections were predictably mixed. Some people expressed sympathy for my situation, calling out the obvious financial abuse. Others questioned why I'd chosen such a public forum to address what they considered a private family matter. A few suggested this was all political theater, that I was working with Senator Hartley to create a narrative that benefited her campaign while damaging my father's influence. I closed the laptop before I could read too deeply. Public opinion would be what it was, shaped by people who didn't know me and never would. What mattered was that the truth was documented, backed by evidence, impossible to dismiss as my misunderstanding or exaggeration. What mattered was that I'd stopped participating in the fiction that we were a close, supportive family when the reality was so starkly different. The afternoon stretched ahead, empty of obligations or expectations. For the first time in years, I had nothing I needed to do, nowhere I needed to be, no one I needed to please. The freedom was disorienting, almost uncomfortable after so long defining myself in relation to their approval. I made lunch mechanically, eating without tasting, my mind still processing the morning's events. The press conference kept replaying in my head, Senator Hartley's words echoing with their careful precision. She'd understood exactly what she was doing, the implications of publicly calling out this kind of exploitation. She'd been willing to use her platform to amplify my story, to lend her credibility to my experience in ways that made it impossible for my family to simply rewrite the narrative. Around 3 o'clock, A new text came through from a number I didn't recognize. Hi Amber. This is Diane Mitchell from Channel 7. I'd love to interview you about this morning's press conference and your experience with political donation transparency. Would you be available for a brief conversation? We can do it at your convenience wherever you feel comfortable. I stared at the message considering. Patricia had warned me about media requests, had suggested I take time before engaging with reporters. But part of me wanted to speak, to tell the story in my own words rather than letting it be shaped entirely by others' interpretations. My academic work had prepared me to discuss campaign finance reform articulately. I understood the systems, could explain the problems clearly. Before I could second-guess the impulse, I typed back. I'd be willing to do an interview. Can we schedule something for Monday? I'd prefer to meet at a neutral location, maybe a coffee shop downtown. The response came quickly. Monday works perfectly. How about 10 o'clock at Lamplighter on Addison? I really appreciate your willingness to share your perspective. I confirmed the time and set my phone aside, feeling simultaneously anxious and determined. The story was going to be told with or without my direct participation. At least this way, I could ensure my voice was part of it, that the narrative included my actual thoughts and experiences rather than just speculation and second-hand accounts. The evening settled over Scott's edition in shades of gold and purple, the summer sun taking its time with sunset. I stood at my window watching the neighborhood transform from day to night, lights coming on in apartments and restaurants, people heading out for Friday evening entertainment. Normal life, continuing around me while my own world had fractured into something new and uncertain. My phone stayed mostly silent as evening deepened. Either my family had given up trying to reach me, or they'd shifted to strategizing about how to respond publicly. I imagined them gathered at the West End house, my father pacing while Preston pulled up news coverage on his tablet, Helen maintaining her careful neutrality while privately calculating her best position. They'd want to control this, to manage the narrative and minimize damage to their reputations. But they couldn't. Not this time. The documentation was too solid, Senator Hartley's platform too prominent, the story too compelling in its basic unfairness. A young woman's inheritance stolen and used for political donations she never authorized, all while she struggled financially and was dismissed as impractical by the very people exploiting her resources. It was the kind of story that resonated beyond politics, touching on universal themes of family betrayal and financial abuse. People who'd never heard of Richard Whitfield or cared about Virginia politics could understand the fundamental wrong of what had been done. That universality was both my protection and my weapon. They couldn't make this go away quietly. As darkness finally settled over the city, I made a decision. I opened my laptop and composed an email to the 3 law firms Patricia had provided contact information for. The message was brief and factual, outlining the situation and requesting consultations about possible legal action to recover my inheritance and address the breach of fiduciary duty. Sending those emails felt like crossing another threshold, moving from public acknowledgement to active pursuit of justice and restitution. The money mattered certainly, but it was more than that. It was about establishing that what they'd done had consequences, that exploiting family members came with costs they couldn't simply ignore or minimize. I hit send on all 3 emails and closed the laptop with a sense of finality. Monday I'd do the interview. Next week I'd meet with attorneys. Step by step I'd build a life that was actually mine, funded by resources I controlled, shaped by priorities I chose. The Whitfield family name might open some doors and close others, but it wouldn't define me anymore. The weekend passed in a strange suspension between my old life and whatever came next. Saturday morning arrived with gray clouds threatening rain, the kind of weather that matched the uncertainty settling in my chest. I'd slept poorly, my dreams filled with fragments of the press conference mixed with memories of my grandmother's kitchen, her hand steady as she taught me to measure flour for biscuits while explaining the importance of standing up for yourself, even when it cost you something. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, finally allowing myself to look through all the messages that had accumulated since Friday morning. Most were from people I barely knew, acquaintances from graduate school or distant relatives expressing shock and offering vague support. A few were from journalists requesting interviews, their messages carefully worded to sound sympathetic while clearly fishing for more dramatic details to flesh out their stories. But one message stood out, Sent late Friday night from an email address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply read, "From another disappointed daughter." I opened it cautiously, half expecting some kind of attack or manipulation disguised as solidarity. Instead, I found a thoughtful message from a woman named Lisa Carmichael who'd seen the news coverage and felt compelled to reach out. She wrote about her own experience with family financial abuse, how her parents had used her credit to open accounts that eventually destroyed her financial standing for years. She'd spent her 20s rebuilding from damage she hadn't caused, learning to set boundaries with people who saw her primarily as a resource to exploit. The email wasn't asking for anything, just offering recognition that what I was going through was real and valid, and harder than most people understood. I read it 3 times, feeling something loosen in my chest. There was comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in this experience, that other people had navigated similar betrayals and survived. I typed a response thanking her for reaching out, for understanding the complicated grief that came with recognizing your family had systematically used you, while making you feel like the problem was your inability to appreciate their vision. By Sunday, the initial media frenzy had cooled slightly, though my name still appeared in several editorial pieces about donor transparency and family exploitation in political fundraising. One columnist used my situation as a launching point for discussing how political donations could mask underlying financial abuse, how the systems designed to track money in politics sometimes failed to catch violations that happen within families or close relationships. I spent most of Sunday preparing for Monday's interview, reviewing my academic work on campaign finance reform, and thinking through how to articulate my experience clearly without becoming overly emotional. Diane Mitchell from Channel 7 had sent over some preliminary questions, giving me a sense of what topics she wanted to cover. Most focused on the technical aspects of how the donations had been made, what legal protections existed for people in similar situations, and what reforms might prevent this kind of abuse in the future. Monday morning arrived bright and clear, the weekend's threatened storms having passed without materializing. I dressed carefully in business casual, wanting to look professional and composed but not overly formal. The interview was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Lamplighter Coffee, a popular spot in Scott's Addition that would provide a casual backdrop while remaining public enough to feel safe. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a tea I didn't really want, and claimed a corner table where we'd have some privacy while remaining visible. My hands wrapped around the warm mug, grounding me as I watched other customers come and go, everyone absorbed in their Monday morning routines and oblivious to the fact that my life had fundamentally changed in the past 72 hours. Diane arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a young man carrying camera equipment. She was older than I'd expected, maybe mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and an air of someone who'd seen enough human drama to approach news stories with both curiosity and compassion. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Amber. I know the past few days have been intense." She gestured to her colleague. "This is Marcus, my cameraman. We'll keep this conversational, nothing too formal or intimidating. If you need to stop at any point, just say so." Marcus set up his equipment efficiently, positioning the camera to capture both of us while keeping the coffee shop's atmosphere visible in the background. Other customers glanced over with mild curiosity, but no one seemed to recognize me or understand what was happening. Just another interview in a city full of them. Another story being captured and packaged for evening news consumption. Diane settled into the chair across from me, a small notebook open in her lap, though I suspected she'd remember most of what I said without needing to reference notes. "Let's start with the basics. When did you first learn that donations were being made in your name?" I took a breath and began explaining, walking her through the discovery of the trust, Walter's revelation, the documentation showing years of contributions I'd never authorized. Diane listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she'd done her research and understood the technical aspects of campaign finance law. "Your father is Richard Whitfield, a well-known political consultant in Richmond. How would you characterize your relationship with him prior to this discovery?" The question was more complicated than it appeared. I thought about all the years of trying to earn his approval, the small dismissals that accumulated into a larger pattern of marginalization. "Distant," I finally said. "He's always been more invested in my brother Preston's career than in my education or goals. I thought that was just how families worked, that parents naturally favored certain children. It wasn't until I saw the documentation that I understood the distance wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. Strategic how? By keeping me uninformed about my own resources, by directing my inheritance toward political priorities that benefited him and my brother, he ensured I remained dependent and compliant. If I'd known about the trust, I might have used that money for different purposes. I might have been able to establish my own career without needing his approval or connections. The financial control was a way of maintaining other kinds of control. Diane's expression shifted to something more empathetic. You recently completed a master's degree in public policy, focusing on campaign finance reform. There's a certain irony in studying the systems that were being used to exploit you. The irony isn't lost on me, I said, managing a slight smile. But in some ways, that academic work gave me the tools to understand what was happening once I had the documentation. I knew enough about PAC structures and donor reporting to recognize that what had been done was legal in the narrowest technical sense, but completely unethical. Without that education, I might have been more easily convinced that this was normal or acceptable. Senator Hartley chose to make your situation very public during her re-election announcement. How did you feel about that decision? I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer would shape how people understood both my motivations and Senator Hartley's. Grateful, I said finally. I could have tried to address this privately within the family, but I already knew how that would go. My father is skilled at reframing situations to make the victim seem unreasonable or ungrateful. By having Senator Hartley present the facts publicly, backed by her credibility and platform, she made it impossible for him to simply gaslight me into questioning my own experience. You're planning to pursue legal action to recover your inheritance? I've consulted with several attorneys who specialize in trust law and financial exploitation. The legal options are complex, but yes, I intend to pursue whatever remedies are available. This isn't just about the money, though that matters. It's about establishing that this behavior has consequences, that you can't systematically exploit family members and face no accountability. Diane asked several more questions about the technical aspects of how the donations had been structured, what reforms I thought might prevent similar situations, and how my academic work informed my perspective on political fundraising. I answered as clearly as I could, trying to balance the personal emotional weight of the situation with the broader policy implications. Finally, she asked the question I'd been expecting and dreading. What would you say to your father if he were here right now? I was quiet for a long moment, staring into my tea as I searched for words that felt true. I'd tell him that love shouldn't require theft, that family isn't supposed to be transactional, with some members valued only for what they can provide to others. I'd tell him that my grandmother's trust wasn't his to redirect, that those funds represented her love and her belief in my potential, and he had no right to use them for his own purposes. I looked up, meeting Diane's eyes directly. But mostly, I'd tell him that I don't need his approval anymore. I spent years contorting myself to earn something he was never willing to give. That time is over. The interview wrapped up shortly after, Marcus efficiently packing away his equipment while Diane thanked me again for my candor. This will air on tonight's 6 o'clock broadcast, and we'll post the full interview online afterward. You did really well, Amber. Your grandmother would be proud. After they left, I sat alone in the coffee shop for a while longer, processing the experience of articulating my story for public consumption. It felt both exposing and strangely liberating, like I'd spoken truths that had been trapped in my chest for so long that finally releasing them created physical space to breathe more deeply. My phone buzzed with a text from one of the law firms I'd contacted. Available for consultation Wednesday at 2 o'clock? We've reviewed your situation and believe we can help you recover your inheritance and potentially pursue damages for breach of fiduciary duty. I confirmed the appointment and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Things were moving forward, systems were engaging, professionals were taking my situation seriously. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing it alone or without resources. The afternoon brought more messages, more interview requests from journalists who'd heard about Diane's upcoming piece and wanted their own angle on the story. I declined most of them, feeling that I'd said what needed to be said and additional interviews would just be repetition. Let the story circulate on its own now. Let people draw their own conclusions from the facts that had been presented. Tuesday morning, I received an email from Patricia Vance with Senator Hartley's office. The senator wanted me to check in and see how you're doing. The press response has been significant, and we want to make sure you have support as this continues to develop. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. I appreciated the gesture, the recognition that exposing this situation publicly created ongoing complications I'd have to navigate. I sent back a brief thank you and assured her I was managing well enough, that the interview with Channel 7 had gone smoothly and I felt prepared for whatever came next. What came next, as it turned out, was my father. He appeared at my apartment building Tuesday evening without warning, his car idling in the fire lane while he stood at the entrance buzzing my unit repeatedly. I saw him on the security camera, his expression tight with barely controlled anger, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he was working hard to maintain composure. I didn't buzz him in. Instead, I used the intercom system to speak to him from the safety of my apartment. I don't want to see you, Dad. Whatever you need to say can be said through attorneys. His voice came through the speaker, distorted and harsh. This is ridiculous, Amber. You've humiliated this family publicly over a misunderstanding. If you just come talk to me like a rational person, we could resolve this. There's nothing to resolve. You stole my inheritance and used it for political donations without my consent. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. I managed your trust responsibly, making investments that benefited the entire family. You're being ungrateful and short-sighted, letting some politician manipulate you into attacking your own father. The word ungrateful triggered something in me. All the years of being told I didn't appreciate enough, didn't understand enough, didn't deserve the position I'd been given in the family hierarchy. Senator Hartley didn't manipulate me. She gave me information you deliberately withheld. She helped me understand that what you did was wrong, legally and morally. You're making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your career. No one in this city will work with someone who publicly attacks their own family. You'll be seen as unstable, vindictive, untrustworthy. Maybe, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. Or maybe people will see me as someone who refused to accept being exploited. Someone with enough backbone to set boundaries even when it cost me something. Either way, it's my reputation to manage, built on my choices instead of your manipulation. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought maybe the conversation was over. Then his voice came through again, quieter but somehow more threatening. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you. She believed in family loyalty above everything. My grandmother believed in education and independence. That's why she left me that trust, Dad. She wanted me to have options to build a life that was mine. You took that away from me, and now you're trying to make me feel guilty for reclaiming it. But it's not going to work anymore. I disconnected the intercom and watched on the camera as he stood there for another minute, clearly debating whether to keep trying. Eventually, he returned to his car and drove away, leaving me standing in my apartment with my heart racing but my resolve stronger than it had been before his arrival. That confrontation, brief and unsatisfying as it was, felt like a turning point. He'd tried his usual tactics, guilt and threat and reframing, and they'd failed. I hadn't crumbled or apologized or agreed to meet privately where he could work on breaking down my resistance. I'd held the boundary, maintained my position, refused to be drawn back into the dynamic where his version of reality was the only one that mattered. Wednesday's consultation with the attorney confirmed what I'd suspected. The case was strong, the documentation clear, the legal precedent favorable. Elizabeth Brennan, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s who specialized in trust litigation, laid out the options methodically. We can pursue full recovery of the misappropriated funds, plus interest and potentially punitive damages for breach of fiduciary duty. Your father was the executor of the trust, which means he had a legal obligation to act in your best interests. Using your inheritance for political donations that primarily benefited other family members is a clear violation of that obligation. How long would litigation take? I asked. Depends on whether they choose to fight or settle. Given the public nature of this situation and the documentation we have, my guess is they'll want to settle relatively quickly to minimize further damage to their reputations. We could potentially have this resolved within 6 months, maybe less. 6 months felt simultaneously too long and surprisingly short. Half a year to reclaim what should have been mine all along, to establish legal accountability for what had been done. It was a price I was willing to pay. Let's proceed. I said, and signed the retainer agreement that would set everything in motion. The following weeks developed a rhythm. Media attention gradually decreased as newer stories captured public interest, though my situation had entered the broader conversation about political fundraising and family exploitation in ways that ensured it wouldn't be completely forgotten. Several policy organizations reached out asking me to speak at events about campaign finance reform, recognizing that my personal experience gave weight to arguments about transparency and donor protection. I accepted some invitations and declined others, learning to manage my public presence in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. Speaking at a symposium on political ethics, I found myself articulating ideas I'd explored in graduate school, but with a new depth of understanding born from lived experience. Theory and reality had merged, giving my academic work a foundation that resonated with audiences in unexpected ways. Preston reached out once, a carefully worded email that acknowledged tensions, while avoiding any direct admission of wrongdoing. He suggested we meet for coffee to discuss the situation as adults, but I recognized the attempt to separate me from my legal representation and declined. Everything he needed to communicate could go through the attorneys now. I was done having conversations designed to make me doubt my own experience or feel guilty for refusing to accept less than I deserved. Helen maintained her careful neutrality for several weeks before finally choosing a side. Her message, when it came, was characteristically strategic. She claimed she'd had no knowledge of how the trust was being managed, that my father had handled those matters without consulting her. She offered to testify on my behalf if needed, positioning herself as another victim of his financial manipulations rather than a complicit partner who'd benefited from the arrangement. I didn't believe her claims of ignorance, but I also didn't reject her offer outright. Let the attorneys determine whether her testimony would be useful. My job was to keep moving forward, building a life that wasn't defined by their dysfunction or dependent on their approval. 3 months after the press conference, on a crisp October morning that painted Richmond in shades of gold and rust, I received notification that my father had agreed to a settlement. The terms were better than I'd expected. Full recovery of the misappropriated funds plus interest, a formal acknowledgement of breach of fiduciary duty, and coverage of all my legal fees. No punitive damages, but I hadn't been pursuing this for punishment. I'd wanted recovery and accountability, and the settlement provided both. Elizabeth called to walk me through the details, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "This is a solid outcome, Amber. You're getting back everything that should have been yours, and the formal acknowledgement makes it clear that what was done was wrong. That matters both for you personally and for the legal record. When will the funds be transferred? Settlement specifies within 30 days. I'd recommend setting up a meeting with a financial advisor to discuss how to manage the inheritance appropriately. You'll want to make thoughtful decisions about investment and use. Honor your grandmother's intentions for these resources." After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table watching autumn light stream through the windows, feeling the weight of these past months. Settling into something like peace. The money would arrive soon, nearly $90,000 plus interest and the additional amounts needed to cover legal costs my father was now responsible for. It was more than I'd had in my entire life, and it represented more than just financial security. It represented autonomy, choice, the ability to build a future on my own terms. I thought about my grandmother, about the woman who'd saved carefully and planned thoughtfully to give me this gift. She'd understood something about the Whitfield family that I'd taken years to learn, had tried to protect me in the only way she could by establishing resources that were supposed to be outside their control. The fact that my father had violated that intention, had found a way to redirect those resources toward his own priorities, said everything about who he was and what he valued. But he hadn't succeeded permanently. The system had eventually corrected, truth had eventually emerged, and now I had the opportunity to use my grandmother's gift the way she'd intended. For education, for independence, for building a life that reflected my values rather than simply serving someone else's ambitions. I spent the afternoon researching financial advisors, looking for someone who understood socially responsible investing and could help me use these resources in ways that aligned with my priorities. I wanted to fund scholarships for first-generation college students, support organizations working on campaign finance reform, maybe even start a small foundation dedicated to helping people escape financial exploitation within families. My grandmother's money could do more than just provide for my own security. It could extend her values outward, creating ripples of impact that honored her memory while addressing the very problems that had nearly prevented me from accessing her gift in the first place. November brought the first real cold, Richmond's trees stripped bare and the James River running gray under overcast skies. The settlement funds transferred exactly on schedule, appearing in my account like a promise finally kept. I met with a financial advisor Patricia Vance had recommended, a thoughtful woman named Grace Wellington who specialized in helping clients align their investments with their values. We talked for hours about my goals, my grandmother's intentions, the kind of impact I wanted these resources to have. Grace listened carefully, and then helped me develop a plan that balanced immediate security with longer-term vision. A portion would go into stable investments providing reliable returns. Another portion would fund the scholarship program I wanted to establish. And a carefully structured amount would support my own continued education and career development, allowing me to pursue work that mattered without constantly worrying about financial survival. By December, I'd formally established the Margaret Whitfield Scholarship Fund, named for my grandmother and dedicated to supporting students from families where education hadn't been traditionally prioritized or financially accessible. The first scholarships would be awarded the following academic year, and I'd recruited a small board of educators and policy experts to help administer the program. The work felt purposeful in ways my previous attempts to build a career never had. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone or earn approval from people determined not to give it. I was simply using resources I'd rightfully inherited to create opportunities for others, extending my grandmother's belief in education's transformative power into a future she'd never see, but had helped make possible. Christmas approached with its usual complicated feelings about family and obligation. I received a card from Helen, generic holiday wishes with her signature and nothing else. Preston sent nothing. My father remained silent, the settlement having apparently exhausted whatever impulse he'd had toward reconciliation or explanation. I spent Christmas Eve volunteering at a community center in Churchill, serving dinner to families who needed support during a season often defined by consumption and excess. It felt more honest than any Whitfield family gathering had ever been. This simple exchange of presence and service among people who understood that survival sometimes meant accepting help, and that dignity didn't require pretending everything was fine. On Christmas morning, I drove to Charlottesville and hiked to a overlook in the Blue Ridge Mountains that my grandmother had loved. The view stretched for miles, ridges folding into distance until they became blue shadows against the sky. She'd brought me here when I was young, pointed out the layers of mountains and talked about perspective, how sometimes you needed distance to understand the true shape of things. Standing there in the cold December wind, I finally understood what she'd meant. The Whitfield family, which had seemed so important and powerful when I was inside it, looked smaller from here. Just one family among many, their influence limited to certain circles, their drama ultimately no more significant than anyone else's struggles with love and betrayal, and the complicated mathematics of loyalty. I'd escaped that small world and found something larger. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but mine. Built on truth instead of performance, on boundaries instead of endless accommodation, on resources I controlled and choices I made freely. My grandmother's gift, properly understood, hadn't just been money. It had been permission to claim my own life, even when that meant walking away from people who'd only ever seen me as a supporting character in their story. The year turned, winter settling deep over Virginia. I moved to a new apartment, larger and brighter, in a neighborhood where no one knew my family history or made assumptions about who I was supposed to be. I adopted a rescue dog who'd been overlooked at the shelter for months, a gangly mixed breed with soulful eyes who seemed to understand that sometimes the ones passed over were actually the ones with the most to offer. My work expanded in unexpected directions. Speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with organizations working on financial literacy and exploitation prevention. My academic credentials, which my father had dismissed as impractical, became the foundation for a career that felt meaningful and sustainable. I wasn't building empires or accumulating political capital, but I was helping people understand systems that often worked against them and find pathways toward greater autonomy. In February, nearly a year after that graduation party where everything had shifted, I received an invitation to testify before a state legislative committee considering reforms to trust administration and donor transparency. The committee chair had read about my situation and thought my perspective would be valuable, as they drafted new regulations designed to prevent similar exploitation. I accepted immediately, recognizing the opportunity to turn personal experience into systemic change. The testimony I prepared was careful and detailed, walking the committee through exactly how the existing regulations had allowed my inheritance to be redirected without my knowledge or consent, and what specific reforms might close those loopholes while preserving legitimate trust administration practices. The morning of the testimony, I stood outside the legislative building watching people stream through security, everyone absorbed in their own missions and priorities. Somewhere in this building, decisions were being made that would shape people's lives in ways both obvious and subtle. The work was messy and political and often frustrating, but it mattered. Systems could be changed, protections could be strengthened, and sometimes the people best positioned to drive that change were those who'd experienced the failures firsthand. I thought about the version of myself who'd stood in her father's garden a year ago, still hoping for acknowledgement that would never come, still trying to earn love from people who saw her primarily as a resource. That Amber felt impossibly distant now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer recognized as myself. The person I'd become through this process was harder, clearer, more certain of her own worth and less willing to compromise it for the comfort of others. The testimony went well, the committee members asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely interested in the reforms I suggested. Several thanked me afterward for my courage in speaking publicly about family exploitation, acknowledging that the topic carried stigma that often kept victims silent. By making my experience visible, I'd apparently given permission for others to name their own situations and seek help. That impact, more than any legal settlement or public vindication, felt like the truest form of justice. Not revenge against people who'd wronged me, but transformation of pain into purpose, private grief into public good. My grandmother would have appreciated that alchemy, the way difficulty could be processed into something useful if you were willing to do the work. Spring arrived with its usual optimism, Richmond's trees exploding into bloom, and the James River running high with seasonal rain. I walked my dog through neighborhoods I was still discovering, building routines that felt sustainable and authentic. The Whitfield family continued their lives across town, and occasionally I'd see my father's name in political coverage or hear about Preston's latest campaign initiatives. But they felt increasingly separate from my daily reality, characters in a story I'd finished reading. The Margaret Whitfield Scholarship Fund awarded its first scholarships in May, supporting 5 students whose academic potential had been limited by family circumstances and financial constraints. I met each recipient individually, heard their stories, and saw my grandmother's values extending into futures she'd never imagined, but would have celebrated. One student, a first-generation college applicant from rural Virginia, thanked me with tears in her eyes. My family doesn't understand why I want to go to university. They think it's a waste, that I should stay home and work. This scholarship means I can choose my own path without feeling like I'm betraying them. I understood exactly what she meant, that complicated grief of choosing yourself when the people who should support you most actively resist your growth. Your grandmother would be proud of you, I told her. And so would mine. The anniversary of that graduation party arrived without fanfare. Just another early June evening warm with approaching summer. I thought about marking it somehow, but ultimately decided that the best tribute to how far I'd come was simply living well, making choices that honored my values, building a life that felt authentically mine. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint Scott's edition in shades of amber and rose. My dog dozed at my feet, my laptop held the draft of an article I was writing about trust reform, and my phone showed messages from colleagues and friends making actual plans rather than performing family obligation. This was freedom, I realized. Not the dramatic kind that came with public vindication or legal settlements, though those had mattered too. This was the quieter, more sustainable freedom of waking up and making choices based on what I actually wanted rather than what others expected. Of knowing my worth wasn't determined by their approval. Of understanding that family was supposed to nurture growth, not restrict it, and that walking away from relationships that diminished you was strength, not failure. My grandmother's gift had finally reached me, years late and filtered through pain, but ultimately intact. She'd given me resources, yes, but more importantly, she'd given me permission to claim my own life, even when that meant disappointing people who demanded I stay small. That permission, properly understood and finally embraced, had been worth every difficult moment of the journey to get here. The city lights began appearing in the gathering dusk, thousands of individual stories unfolding in homes and apartments across Richmond. My story was just one among many, no more or less significant than anyone else's struggles toward authenticity and freedom. But it was mine, built from pieces I'd chosen, reflecting values I'd claimed, moving toward futures I'd defined. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 2 years had passed since that graduation party, and Richmond looked different through the windows of my new office. Not because the city had changed, but because I had. The view stretched across downtown from the 15th floor, showing the Capitol building where I'd testified, the neighborhoods where I'd struggled, and somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the West End estate where my father still orchestrated his diminishing influence. The Margaret Whitfield Institute for Financial Justice had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a scholarship fund had expanded into a full nonprofit organization addressing family financial exploitation, providing legal resources, educational programming, and advocacy for policy reform. We'd helped over 200 families navigate situations similar to mine, connected them with attorneys, and supported them through the complicated process of reclaiming resources that had been taken without consent. My assistant knocked softly on the open door. "Your 3 o'clock is here." The documentary crew from the investigative series? I'd almost forgotten about the interview, my calendar having filled with the kind of meaningful work that made time disappear. A production company was creating a documentary about political fundraising transparency, and they'd reached out months ago requesting my participation. I'd hesitated initially, wary of rehashing painful history for public consumption, but eventually agreed when I learned the documentary would focus on systemic reform rather than personal drama. The crew set up efficiently, their equipment more sophisticated than what Diane Mitchell had used for that first interview 2 years ago. The director, a woman named Simone Harper whose previous work had exposed corruption in state contracting, settled into the chair across from my desk with the ease of someone comfortable asking difficult questions. "Let's start with where you are now," she said after the preliminaries. "The Institute has become a significant voice in trust reform and donor transparency. Did you imagine this trajectory when Senator Hartley first acknowledged your contributions?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest without sounding falsely humble. I imagined justice for myself, recovery of what had been stolen, maybe helping a few other people avoid similar situations. But this? I gestured around the office at the staff working in the open space beyond, at the case files representing hundreds of families we'd served. This exceeded anything I could have predicted. Turns out there were a lot of people waiting for permission to name what had been done to them, waiting for someone to say that family exploitation isn't acceptable just because it's legal or common. "Your father has largely withdrawn from public political consulting. Some people attribute that to the fallout from your case. How do you feel about that?" The question was designed to elicit either guilt or satisfaction, but I felt neither emotion cleanly. My father made choices that had consequences. Those consequences weren't punishment I inflicted. They were natural results of his actions becoming public knowledge. People stopped wanting to work with someone who defrauded his own daughter. That's not my responsibility to manage or feel guilty about. Simone nodded, making a note. "Your brother Preston lost his most recent campaign for state delegate. Exit polling suggested voters had concerns about family values and financial ethics. Do you see a connection to your situation? Preston built his career on money that wasn't his to use, on a foundation of exploitation he either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. When that foundation became visible, it affected how people saw him. That's appropriate. We should care about the character of people seeking to represent us, about whether they have integrity in their private dealings." The interview continued for another hour, covering the Institute's work, the legislative reforms we'd helped pass, and the broader cultural conversation about family financial abuse that had gained traction in recent years. Simone asked about my personal life too, whether I'd reconciled with any family members, how I'd processed the grief of essentially losing everyone I'd grown up with. "I didn't lose them," I said carefully. "I recognized what had always been true, that those relationships were conditional and transactional. That's different from loss. Loss implies you had something real that disappeared. What I had was an illusion that finally cleared, And what replaced it was truth. Truth is harder than illusion, but it's also more solid. You can build an actual life on it. After the crew packed up and left, I stood at the window watching evening settle over the city. My reflection in the glass showed someone who'd aged in ways that weren't entirely about years passing. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there at my graduation, a certain set to my shoulders that suggested hard-won confidence rather than inherited privilege. My phone buzzed with a message from Grace Wellington, my financial advisor. The Institute's endowment had reached a significant milestone, enough to ensure sustainability for at least the next decade, even if fundraising slowed. My grandmother's inheritance, carefully invested and supplemented by donations from people who believed in our mission, had multiplied into something that would outlast me, extending her values forward in time. I thought about her often, especially during moments when the work felt particularly meaningful. She died believing her careful planning had secured my future, never knowing that her own son would violate that intention. But somehow, through the complicated alchemy of betrayal and recovery, her gift had ended up creating something larger than either of us could have imagined. Not just my personal security, but a system helping hundreds of people reclaim their autonomy and resources. The following week brought an unexpected letter, delivered to the Institute with my name handwritten on the envelope. The return address showed a residential facility in Charlottesville. Inside, I found a brief note from Helen, my mother, explaining that she'd moved there 6 months ago after my father's health had declined significantly. A stroke had left him partially paralyzed, unable to manage the estate or continue his consulting work, and she decided that continuing to live in that house alone felt pointless. The note was characteristically practical, avoiding emotional language while conveying essential information. She'd sold the West End property and downsized dramatically, using the proceeds to secure care for my father and establish herself in a senior community where she could have independence without the burden of maintaining appearances she no longer cared about. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she'd written, "I know we can't undo what was done, but I wanted you to know that your grandmother would be proud of the work you're doing. She always said you had more integrity than the rest of us combined." Turns out she was right. I read the note 3 times, searching for manipulation or hidden agenda, but finding only what appeared to be genuine acknowledgement. Helen had always been strategic, but perhaps age and circumstance had finally stripped away some of the performance, leaving something more honest underneath. I didn't respond immediately, needing time to process what this communication meant and what, if anything, I wanted to do with it. The old impulse to accept any crumb of acknowledgement, to be grateful for minimal recognition, had faded over the past 2 years. If I engaged with Helen now, it would be on my terms, in ways that felt authentic rather than obligatory. A month later, I drove to Charlottesville on a Saturday afternoon when the autumn colors were at their peak. The residential facility was pleasant and well-maintained, designed for active seniors who wanted community without surrendering independence. Helen's apartment was on the 2nd floor, modest but comfortable, decorated with a few pieces from the West End house and many items I didn't recognize. She looked older than I'd expected, her hair completely white now, her frame thinner than I remembered. But her eyes were clear, and when she opened the door, her expression showed something that might have been relief. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said simply. I wasn't sure either. We sat in her small living room, tea between us, and talked with a directness that felt new and uncomfortable. She didn't apologize for the past, exactly, but she acknowledged her complicity in maintaining a system that had harmed me. She explained in careful detail how she'd convinced herself that going along with my father's decisions was necessary for family harmony, how she'd prioritized avoiding conflict over protecting her daughter. I told myself I didn't have power in that marriage, that Richard made all the important decisions and my job was just to smooth things over socially, she said, staring into her tea. But that was a convenient lie. I had power. I chose not to use it. I chose comfort over courage, and you paid the price for that choice. The admission was more than I'd expected, more honest than I'd thought her capable of being. It didn't erase the past or suddenly make us close, but it created a small opening for something more real than we'd ever had before. "What changed?" I asked. "His stroke," she said bluntly. Suddenly I was making all the decisions, managing everything, and I realized how much I'd surrendered by pretending to be powerless. And then I started reading about your work, about the Institute and the families you're helping. I saw what you'd built from the wreckage of what we'd done to you, and I understood that my loyalty had been misplaced. I'd been protecting a man and a system that didn't deserve protection. We talked for 2 hours, not resolving everything but beginning a conversation that felt more honest than any we'd had when I was growing up. When I left, she walked me to my car and hugged me briefly, something she'd rarely done even when I was young. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. Really see you. And I'm genuinely proud of who you've become, even though I can't take any credit for it. The drive back to Richmond felt different, lighter somehow, as if acknowledging the truth with Helen had released some weight I'd been carrying without fully recognizing it. I wouldn't suddenly have the mother I'd wished for as a child, but I might eventually have an honest relationship with the woman she actually was. That felt like enough, maybe even more than enough. Winter arrived with unusual intensity that year, snow covering Richmond in ways that disrupted the city's normal rhythms. The Institute shifted to remote operations for several days, our staff working from home while the city gradually cleared roads and restored regular function. I used the unexpected quiet to work on a book I'd been drafting, a practical guide for people navigating family financial exploitation. The manuscript had grown from a simple resource document into something more comprehensive, combining legal information with psychological insight and personal narrative. My editor thought it had potential to reach beyond people currently experiencing exploitation, to serve as a prevention tool for anyone trying to establish healthy financial boundaries with family members. You're not just telling your story, she'd said during our last meeting. You're giving people language and frameworks they can use before situations become crises. That's valuable in ways that extend beyond any single case. By spring, the book was finished and scheduled for publication in early summer. The advance reviews were strong, with several noting that it filled a significant gap in available resources about family financial dynamics. A major publisher had picked it up, ensuring distribution beyond the limited audience that might find a small press release. The Institute planned a launch event, inviting our donors and community partners to celebrate both the book and the organization's continued growth. We'd recently hired 2 additional staff members, expanded our legal clinic hours, and begun developing curriculum for high schools about financial literacy and exploitation prevention. The work felt sustainable now, built on systems that could continue growing even as individual leadership changed. On the evening of the book launch, I stood in a gallery space in Scott's Addition surrounded by people who'd supported this journey in various ways. Walter Brennan was there, retired now but still following Richmond politics with interest. Several of the scholarship recipients had come, young people who'd used the opportunities we provided to build futures that honored their own priorities. Grace Wellington brought several of her clients who were interested in socially responsible investing. And Helen came, surprising me by making the drive from Charlottesville. She stood near the back, not trying to insert herself into the center of attention, just present in a way that suggested she understood the significance of what had been built and wanted to witness it. When I spoke to the assembled group, I kept my remarks focused on the work rather than personal vindication. I talked about my grandmother's values, about the hundreds of families we'd served, about the systemic changes that were slowly making it harder for people to exploit relatives without consequence. I acknowledged the pain that had initiated this journey, while emphasizing that pain could be transformed into purpose if you were willing to do the work. 2 years ago, I stood on a stage beside Senator Hartley while she told a truth I hadn't known myself, I said. That moment changed everything, not because it was dramatic or satisfying in some simple way, but because it forced me to stop waiting for approval from people who'd never planned to give it. It freed me to build something real instead of continuing to chase an illusion. After the formal program ended, people mingled and talked, the conversations flowing easily between personal connections and professional interests. Helen approached me near the end of the evening, when most guests had already left. Your grandmother would have loved this, she said quietly, gesturing around the gallery at the photos documenting the Institute's work. She always said you had a gift for seeing what needed fixing and refusing to accept that it couldn't be changed. I wish she could have seen it, I said honestly. Maybe she did, Helen replied. Not this specifically, but the potential for it. That's why she structured the trust the way she did, why she was so careful about her instructions. She knew what your father was, what I was. She was trying to protect you from us. The admission hung between us, stark and undeniable. Helen didn't shy away from it, just held my gaze steadily, letting the truth exist without trying to soften it. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. For naming it clearly. She nodded and, prepared to leave, then paused. I know we can't have the relationship you deserve to have with a mother. But if you're willing, I'd like to have whatever relationship we can build from here. Honest, limited maybe, but real. I'd like that too, I said and meant it. After everyone left, I stood alone in the gallery looking at the timeline we'd created showing the Institute's development over 2 years. Photos of families we'd helped, documentation of legislative changes we'd supported, testimonials from people who'd reclaimed resources they'd thought were permanently lost. It was substantial, meaningful, the kind of legacy my grandmother would have valued. This was what justice looked like, I realized. Not revenge or punishment or even full reconciliation. Just the steady work of building something good from pain. Of refusing to let betrayal define you, while also refusing to pretend it hadn't happened. The complexity felt appropriate. More honest than simple narratives of triumph or tragedy. I locked up the gallery and walked to my car through streets that were fully mine now, not shadowed by family reputation or constrained by their expectations. The city had always been here, but I'd needed to claim my place in it, rather than accepting the position others had assigned me. That claiming had cost something certainly, but it had also given me everything that mattered. My phone showed a message from one of the scholarship recipients, a photo of her college acceptance letter with a caption reading, "Because you helped me believe I deserved this. Thank you for showing me that choosing yourself isn't selfish." I saved the message, adding it to a folder of similar notes I'd collected over the past 2 years. These were the moments that justified everything. The evidence that pain transformed into purpose could reach beyond individual healing, to create actual change in other people's lives. The drive home took me past the West End neighborhood where I'd grown up, where the old estate had been sold to a young family who'd completely renovated it. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and I could see children's toys scattered across the lawn. The house looked different now, freed from the weight of performance and pretense that had defined it during my childhood. That felt right, that physical space being reclaimed and reimagined by people who might fill it with actual warmth instead of carefully maintained appearances. Nothing was permanent, not reputation or influence or carefully constructed family narratives. Everything could be transformed if you were willing to see clearly and act accordingly. At home, my dog greeted me with enthusiasm, and I took her for a walk through the neighborhood before settling in for the evening. The manuscript for my second book sat on my desk. This one focused on organizational strategies for nonprofits addressing family exploitation. There was always more work to do, more systems to change, more people who needed support navigating situations they'd been taught to accept as normal. But tonight, I just sat by the window and watched the city lights shimmer across the darkness, feeling something close to contentment. Not perfect happiness or complete resolution, but the steady satisfaction of building a life that aligned with my values, that honored my grandmother's legacy, that helped other people find their own paths toward freedom and authenticity. This was enough. This was everything. And tomorrow the work would continue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.